Welcome, dear listeners. For tonight's last episode in our Echoes of the Damned October series, I regale you with not just one haunting tale, but four. Prepare yourselves, for we shall delve into the terrifying underbelly of Edinburgh, where shadows whisper and spirits roam freely. From sinister vaults beneath Southbridge to a house cursed by dark sorcery, these are the stories that time itself dares not forget. Are you ready to uncover the horror that lies in Edinburgh's most haunted corners? For our first stop, we uncover the ghastly and spine chilling history of a place that has terrorized Edinburgh for centuries. A place that has left its eerie mark on the very stones of the city's cobbled streets. This is the story of Major Thomas Weir, the so-called Wizard of West Bow. Today, Edinburgh's West Bow is a beautiful, picturesque location, a haven of quaint shops, cobbled streets, and charming cafes. But beneath its cheery facade lurks a far darker past. The West Bow was once home to one of the city's most feared and reviled residents, Major Thomas Weir. A man whose shocking confessions of occult practices and unspeakable crimes shook 17th century Edinburgh to its core. A man who, to this day, still walks the shadowy halls of his former home, more than 300 years after his death. Major Thomas Weir, once a well-respected figure at Edinburgh, a Covenanter soldier and strict Presbyterian, known for his piety and religious devotion. He would hold prayer sessions that drew crowds from the local area, and in 1650 he was even appointed commander of the Edinburgh Town Guard. By all appearances, he was an upstanding citizen. But as the saying goes, appearances can be deceiving. In 1670, at the age of 70, Thomas Weir fell gravely ill. Confined to his bed, he began acting strangely, speaking in fits of delirium, and confessing to a life steeped in sin and unimaginable evil. He claimed to be an occultist, a practitioner of the dark arts. He confessed to acts of bestiality, incest, necromancy, and witchcraft. The authorities, including the Lord Provost, were horrified. At first, they refused to believe him. How could this pious man, this respected member of society, be capable of such abominable acts? But Weir's confessions, they didn't stop, and soon they were echoed by his own sister, Jean. Jean Weir, equally twisted, spoke of strange encounters with demonic forces. She claimed that her brother had once been whisked away in a fiery demonic coach, taken to the town of Dalkeith, where he was given supernatural intelligence by one of Satan's own minions. And she revealed something even more sinister, the source of Weir's dark power. A walking stick. No ordinary stick, mind you. This was a gift from the devil himself, topped with a carved human head. Jean insisted that this macabre staff was the source of all of Weir's unholy powers. By now, the authorities could no longer ignore the dark revelations. Weir and his sister were both arrested and interrogated at the Edinburgh Tolbooth. The evidence was overwhelming. Found guilty of an abhorrent list of sins, they were sentenced to death. But it was the manner of Weir's death that would cement his infamy. He was garroted and burned alive at Gallowly, his cursed walking stick consumed by the flames beside him. His last words, not of repentance, not of sorrow, but of defiance.
Let me alone. I have lived as a beast, and I must die as a beast.
Jean Weir met her end at the gallows in the Grassmarket, her body left to rot in the shadows of Edinburgh. Their corpses were buried beneath the gallows of Shrub Hill, their evil seeping into the ground. And as for their house on Westbow, it lay empty for over a century, abandoned, feared, haunted by the horrors committed within its walls. Locals whispered that the house was cursed, that no one dared live there. It was said that a couple in the late 1700s bought the house, but they managed only a single night before being driven out by terrifying apparitions. A ghostly calf sitting at the foot of their bed, watching them, unblinking. Over the years, others spoke of strange noises, eerie music drifting from the empty building, windows glowing with ghostly light, and shadowy figures moving through the halls. Perhaps the most chilling sight of all was that of the demonic coach, pulled by 6 fiery horses, waiting outside the house, ready to whisk its next victim away to hell. For years, it was believed that the house had been demolished in the 19th century to rid the city of its dark history. But that, my dear listeners, was not the truth. In 2014, it was discovered that rather than being destroyed, part of Weir's house had been incorporated into a new building. Today, the Quaker Meeting House stands in its place, and if you venture down into the building's basement to the toilets of all places, you may find yourself standing within the very walls that once contained the Wizard of West Bow. Visitors to the Quaker Meeting House have reported strange sightings, the ghostly figure of Thomas Weir himself, still wandering through the walls of his former home, his dark legacy forever tied to the streets of Edinburgh. Even in death, it seems, Major Thomas Weir is not yet finished with this world. For our next story, we're stepping into a place dripping with sinister history, where the very air seems thick with the presence of restless souls. In the heart of Edinburgh's old town, along Nidri Street, lies a pub like no other, its walls soaked in centuries of blood, despair, and eerie whispers. This is Scotland's most haunted pub, the Banshee Labyrinth. But before we quench our thirst with its chilling tales, let me warn you, this isn't your average ghost story. You see, the Banshee Labyrinth is home to more than just your typical spirits. No, here the cries of a wailing banshee echo through the ancient halls, foretelling death, grief, and perhaps something even more sinister. Nestled in the labyrinthine streets of Edinburgh's infamous underground vaults, the Banshee Labyrinth has a past darker than most. These vaults, hidden deep beneath the city, were once a haven for criminals and the destitute. But amidst the shadows, countless people met gruesome ends in this cold, suffocating darkness. Part of the pub is built directly into these vaults, and it's easy to imagine the suffering that took place here, the despair that still clings to the stone walls. Many visitors and locals alike have encountered strange apparitions, mysterious noises, and sudden bursts of terror as though something unseen lingers just behind them, watching. But the labyrinth's terror doesn't end with the vaults. It also sits adjacent to where the grand home of one Lord Nicol Edwards once stood. Lord Edwards, a wealthy aristocrat during the time of King James in the 1500s, was known for one thing in particular, his twisted obsession with witchcraft. Legend has it that this man, consumed by his fear and fascination with the occult, would bring women he suspected of being witches back to his home, only to subject them to horrific torture. Many never made it out alive. Their cries of agony have long since faded from human ears, but their spirits? They're said to have stuck around, tethered to the earth by pain and rage. One of these tortured souls is believed to be the Banshee herself, the very spirit from whom the pub takes its name. You see, a Banshee is no ordinary ghost. Her blood-curdling wail is said to foreshadow the death of a loved one. Some claim that this Banshee may be one of Lord Nicol's victims, cursed to wander the world in sorrow and fury, warning others of impending tragedy. During the pub's renovations, a workman had a chilling encounter with this spectral Banshee. As he toiled away in the old walls of the labyrinth, he noticed a woman in a tattered gray dress, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. At first, she seemed almost human, but as she lifted her head, he saw her face, gaunt, pale, with rotted teeth and blackened hollows where her eyes should have been. And then she screamed. The man, frozen with terror, felt the icy grip of dread. But the worst was yet to come. Moments after that horrifying wail, he received a phone call. A family member had died. Coincidence? Perhaps. But in the Banshee Labyrinth, coincidence feels like an excuse to explain away the impossible. But this pub isn't haunted by just one spirit. Oh no. Let me introduce you to Molly. In 1814, a 6-year-old girl named Molly disappeared into the shadows of Edinburgh, never to be seen again. It wasn't until years later, when the pub's old chimney was uncovered, that they found a small, worn-out shoe. And carved into the leather, just barely visible, was one name: Molly. Ever since, Molly's spirit has been spotted wandering through the pub. Visitors have seen the fleeting figure of a little girl, giggling as she plays her endless games of hide-and-seek in the darkest corners of the labyrinth. But make no mistake, her laughter is far from innocent. And then there's old Jock, a ghost who seems to have a fondness for mischief. He's notorious for lurking around the ladies' toilets, slamming doors and turning the hand dryers on and off at will. It's almost as if he enjoys reminding people that they're never truly alone in the labyrinth. But perhaps the most terrifying specter to haunt this pub is one known only as the Watcher. Dressed in a long black coat, this faceless figure is often seen standing in the shadows, silently observing. Those who've encountered him say that under the brim of his wide hat, there's nothing. No face, no eyes, just a void staring back at you. So, my dear listeners, if you ever find yourself wandering the streets of Edinburgh, feeling brave enough to venture into the Banshee Labyrinth, remember this. The spirits here are not just relics of the past. They are very much present, lurking in every corner, watching your every move, waiting for the right moment to let you know they're there. Now, let's descend into the haunted depths of one of Scotland's most notorious locations, Mary King's Close, a place where history and horror intertwine. Picture this. You're walking through the shadowed streets of Edinburgh, but beneath your feet, hidden from the world above, lies a labyrinth of forgotten alleys, a buried world where time has stopped and something else lingers. The year is 1645. Edinburgh is a bustling city, but beneath the old town, a maze of narrow streets and towering buildings creates a dark, claustrophobic world. This underground world, known as Mary King's Close, is named after a 17th century merchant, Mary King, who once lived and worked in this very place. But even she couldn't have known the horrors that would later haunt these alleys. These closes were once thriving streets, with houses that stretched up to 7 stories high. The wealthier residents lived at the top, basking in what little sunlight would pierce the crowded city, while the poor were trapped at the bottom, right at street level, where filth and disease were always close at hand. And it was disease that would soon doom this place. The plague, Edinburgh's darkest hour. In the mid-1600s, the Black Death crept through the streets like an unseen predator, hunting the old and young alike. But in Mary King's Close, it found the perfect breeding ground. The people lived piled on top of each other, with no sewage system to protect them from the filth that swirled around their homes. Imagine, every day, residents would wait for the cry of "Gardy Lou" before tossing their waste, human excrement, into the streets. It flowed through channels cut into the cobblestones, straight towards the rancid waters of Nor Loch, where the stench of death and decay already hung heavy in the air. No wonder the plague found such willing victims here. Contrary to the legends, Mary King's close wasn't sealed with the plague written inside. Many left for Muir, a place where the healthy could escape the sickness. But some remained, the ones too sick to move, the ones who chose to stay. They went about their days, running their businesses, as death slowly crept closer. White flags hung from windows, signaling a household in need of food or coal. And then came the plague doctors, walking among the doomed, dressed in their terrifying leather suits and those infamous beaked masks. One such doctor was George Ray. Imagine him now, his long, black cloak sweeping the filthy streets, his leather gloves smeared with soot and the blood of his patients, the beak of his mask stuffed with pungent herbs meant to ward off the miasma. But it wasn't the air that carried death, it was the fleas, swarming unseen on the rats and the bodies of the dead. Dr. Ray would enter homes and perform the grim task of treating the afflicted. He would slice open the swollen, oozing boils of plague victims, letting the pus drain, and then, with no time for pity, he'd cauterize the wounds with a red-hot poker. Brutal, yes, but it worked. And Ray saved more lives than anyone could have imagined. Yet despite his heroics, the city council, the very people who had promised to pay him, never gave him his due. Dr. Ray lived out his days penniless, haunted by the horrors he had seen. As the plague finally loosened its grip on Edinburgh, Mary King's Close was all but abandoned. The Royal Exchange was built on top of it in the 18th century, crushing what remained of the once thriving streets. Shops and businesses slowly closed their doors. One of the last to leave was the Cheney family, who saw business operated right up until 1902. And then, silence. The close was sealed and forgotten, lost beneath the city. For years, its ghostly secrets lay buried, until road workers accidentally punched through the ground and rediscovered this hidden underworld. But Mary King's Close didn't stay quiet for long. Some say the close is alive, not with the living, but with the spirits of those who could never leave. A lawyer named Thomas Coldheart and his family refused to flee when others did. It's said they were nearly driven mad by the apparitions they encountered, disembodied limbs floating in the air, a ghostly child, and the horrifying specter of a dog, rotting and grotesque, that would curl up on their chairs as if waiting for its master to return. And then there's Annie, one of the most well-known spirits of Mary King's Close. Annie is a little girl whose presence has been felt by countless visitors. A Japanese medium was one of the first to encounter her. As the medium prepared to leave the close, she felt a tug on her coat. Turning, she saw a small girl huddled in the corner, her face streaked with tears. Annie spoke of dying alone during the plague of 1645. Her only companion in those final days had been her doll, which she lost before she died. She was lonely, so terribly lonely. Moved by the child's sorrow, the medium left her a doll. Since then, visitors have continued to leave dolls and gifts for the lost spirit of Annie, trying in some small way to soothe the pain of a child who's been dead for centuries. Mary King's Close remains one of the most haunted places in Scotland. Visitors often feel a chill in the air, hear whispers in the dark, or see shadowy figures flitting just out of sight. But perhaps the true terror of Mary King's Close isn't just the ghosts that roam there. It's the reminder of how fragile life was and still is. We live, we die, and sometimes we linger. If you ever visit, remember to look out for Annie. Maybe she'll tug on your sleeve, asking for a doll. Or maybe you'll just hear her crying in the dark. For our final story, we descend into the haunted, claustrophobic darkness beneath Edinburgh's historic South Bridge, a place where the living once thrived, but now only the dead remain. The Edinburgh Vaults. Hidden beneath the bustling streets, these vaults were constructed in the 18th century, built to accommodate the city's rapidly expanding population. But what started as an underground business hub quickly became a den of poverty, despair, and criminal activity. And today, it's known as one of the most haunted places in all of Britain. But before we get too deep into the ghosts that dwell here, let's start at the beginning. It all began in 1785, when the construction of Southbridge commenced. 19 massive arches were built to support this ambitious project, and by 1788, the vaults beneath it were ready. Over 120 rooms designed for cobblers, taverns, and merchants to ply their trades. But as the city's prosperity above ground grew, the vaults fell victim to their own flaws. In 1795, the vaults flooded. Dampness seeped through every crack in the stone, and the businesses above slowly abandoned this underground world. The once bustling chambers became dark, wet, and empty, or so it seemed. But beneath the surface, something far more sinister began to take hold. The vaults became home to the poor, the destitute, and the criminal. Brothels, illegal taverns, and hideouts for body snatchers flourished in the shadows. It's whispered that even Burke and Hare, the infamous serial killers who sold corpses to medical schools, may have stalked these very halls, hunting for their next victim. Though there's no concrete proof, the vault's sinister atmosphere and the numerous reports of paranormal activity suggest that unspeakable horrors took place here. Over the years, many spirits have made themselves known to those who dared to enter the vaults. Take, for instance, the ill-fated opening of Southbridge. An elderly woman, wealthy and influential, had followed the construction of the bridge and requested to be the first to cross it. However, she died just before the grand opening. Determined to honor her wish, her friends carried her coffin across the bridge, making her the first soul to pass over it. Many believed this was a bad omen, and they were right. The vaults beneath Southbridge became a place of despair, disease, and death. It's hard to imagine that families lived down here in the damp, unlit corridors, but they did. Corpses were stored here too, whether from murder or natural causes. The smell of rot and decay filled the air. And the dead weren't just buried here. Body snatchers used the vaults as storage for their grim merchandise. Corpses were dug up and hidden in the vaults until they could be sold to medical schools for dissection. The rich could afford to protect their dead with iron cages called more safes, but the poor, they could only pray their loved ones would rest in peace. Many did not. Now, let me take you to one of the most haunted areas, the double height room. This eerie chamber feels as though it was once two rooms stacked on top of each other, and it is haunted by a figure known as the aristocrat. This ghostly figure has been seen multiple times, and his appearance is unsettling. He wears a tall hat and bears a striking resemblance to Abraham Lincoln, of all people. But that's not the only thing lurking in the shadows here. Animals refuse to enter the double height room. Dogs, in particular, whimper and bark as though they sense something far beyond human understanding. And those who do enter, they report a strange bird-like apparition swooping down to claw at unsuspecting visitors. Then there's the tavern room, another eerie chamber where the aristocrat's presence can be felt. Some psychics believe the spirit's name was Finian or Jerian Mackenzie, and it's said that he may have been part of Edinburgh's notorious Hellfire Club. Not to be confused with the Irish Hellfire Club, this group of gentlemen was said to be involved in dark rituals. Some visitors report seeing a black mass hovering near the ceiling, or feeling as though they've been struck with sudden drunkenness, staggering and giggling uncontrollably. It's as if the spirits are pulling them into a wild, inebriated frenzy. But not all spirits in the vaults are malicious. In the room of the cobbler, there's a friendly ghost. A short, stocky man from the late 1700s, this shoemaker is still hard at work, even in death. He sits smiling, laughing, and curiously examining visitors' shoes, though he's baffled by modern footwear, especially Velcro. Psychics have even suggested that the cobbler's room is a safe haven. They claim that if any dark spirits threaten you, the cobbler will protect you. Even Mr. Boots, the vault's most malevolent spirit, avoids the cobbler's room. But let's talk about Mr. Boots. This towering figure stalks the White Room, the most active and terrifying parts of the vaults. Mr. Boots is a dark presence, known to leave scratch marks on visitors, drain camera batteries, and cause lights to flicker and die. His leather boots echo through the chambers, announcing his arrival. People have reported the sensation of him sneaking up behind them, his foul breath on their necks. Some claim he was a body snatcher, others a murderer. But whatever he was in life, in death he is a force to be feared. His domain is the White Room, and he does not take kindly to intruders. If you hear his boots behind you, run. But even Mr. Boots has his limits. The cobbler's room seems to be the one place where the spirits can find peace, where Mr. Boots himself dares not tread. Yet there are more spirits in the vaults. A young boy named Jack or James is often seen in the wine vault. With his blonde curls and blue suit, he's an innocent child, though one haunted by the presence of Mr. Boots. He's known to tug on women's sleeves, looking for a mother figure, or to sing softly in the distance, luring others towards him. But there is sadness here too, like the veiled woman. In the cobbler's room, a woman dressed entirely in black has been seen grieving for the child she lost. Stones have been thrown at visitors, and women, in particular, feel her anguish, sometimes experiencing sharp abdominal pains or sudden grief. And now, dear listeners, you know the stories of the Edinburgh vaults, the haunted, forgotten world beneath the city. If you're brave enough, you can visit. But remember, the spirits here do not forget, and they certainly do not forgive. And so, dear listeners, our journey through the shadows of Europe's most haunted places comes to an end. I hope you enjoyed these episodes as much as I enjoyed creating them. As the veil between the living and the dead thins, I wish you all a haunted and mysterious Halloween, and a blessed Samhain. Until next time, my ghoulish fiends, beware what may be lurking in the shadows.